And I think if you want to mute yourself so other people don't get echo. And now, just this idea of this class just started out on a lark. I think on Rich Kennedy, who some of you know, we had talked about Midgley and about the lead carbon tetrachloride, and then Florida may have bad schools, but they have great libraries. So at our library thing, there were several books on display, and this is written by a Englishman who has just published a book called The Car, a type thing. So I just finished it on the one weekend. I said, this is fascinating stuff. So I called up Joseph McAuliffe. I said, has anybody ever done a history on cars? He said, no, I don't recall. So I said, okay, I'll take up the mantle. And just I figured out, that after living in Detroit for 3 years in residency, I had never been to the Dearborn Museum. That's on my bucket list to do next time, this time summer when we go up there. And looking up that made me decide, there is a Tampa Car Museum, but unfortunately that's in St. Pete and it's in Pinellas County. So it's, I don't know how good it is, but if it's, has anybody seen it type thing, there's a Tampa Car Museum type thing. So I think it's a privately owned, I'm sure, but it showed up type thing. So, okay. Right. This is, obviously, so when I trained in Detroit, the chief of my cardiology's name was a physician, and his name was Dr. Axelrod. So what an appropriate name for a guy from Detroit, Dr. Axelrod. And he was absolutely, delightful hematologist, and but anyways, so and there are varieties of names, type of that comes around type thing, and the history of invention is just fascinating. But I'm going to go back further, so we can call it cars, motor cars, automobile, limousine, sedan, station wagon, and for the Brits in the crowd, estate wagon, spider, locomobile. I did not know it's called locomobile, but that was the name. So from a humble beginning, just sometime like 1890, we've gone up to 237 million cars in US. Only faster penetration at that is that of smartphone. There are about 307 smartphones, and that's a faster penetration. And, so this is like, the number of ownership has just dramatically exploded type of thing. But at the same time, we worry about gun deaths, okay, which is rightly so. But we have 40,000 deaths in 2020 of automobile accidents. This is in spite of 90% people wearing seatbelts. Okay, so it's a staggering number. I mean, this is nothing to sneeze at type of thing. So these are data that is sobering type of thing as to, and then started looking at biography of Henry Ford, and he was just born shortly around the time of Civil War, and after the Civil War, and then he lived up to Second World War. So, and that obviously, there are a famous line of cars called Lincoln, so it just says, and when you think about it, that Lincoln freed, the African Americans, but at the same time, when we talk about cars, it gave us freedom to all of us, basically, type of thing. So you realize as to how, but in railway, you are decided you're traveling with people, but the individual freedom and the rise of dopamine that we get type thing. So, and I think in one of my class on aging, I talked about seven stages of men type of thing, as to how, like from poop to guns type of thing, to money, to sex, to money type of thing. Those are the 7 stages of men, and then we go back in the full circle. The same way we talked about, from like games and playing to cars and guns for boys, and then money, and then, sex and then money. And then again, when we get a little older, we want to buy a fancier car type of thing. It's like we have the midlife crisis and you want to buy the touring car, And I have a standing joke type of thing, we're married, for about 7 or 8 years, type thing. That time Lexus was coming out. So I told my wife, say like, this is 70-year age, what is better, to get a new wife or to get a new car? Her advice was the car is cheaper. So I settled, I took her advice, and we are still married after 38 years. Okay. So that's the story as to how men go through type thing. So it has to be, and so it's an interesting human paradox type of thing that we have created. And then again, I'll go back to further, and I thought, okay, I'll go back to the very beginning type of thing, as to, it's somewhat of a enigma as to when the wheel was discovered. I mean, obviously, when we talk about European history, nothing goes beyond Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. So, and this was the potter's wheel were in vogue, as far back in 5,500 years ago. So, like 3,500 BC before current era, type of thing. And again, and then some wheelbarrows that were invented again with a single wheel in the Greek culture, and these were okay. And then again, there are other modes of transportation where are a lot more in vogue type of thing. And again, some of the other cultures had some earlier starts, but in terms of archaeological finding, this was, I think some of you may know this, but this was fascinating that in the marshes in current day, this would be Slovenia, I think, a wheel was discovered. Now, this is not cut out from a gigantic tree, because they didn't have enough metallurgy to do this. But these are varieties of wooden planks that are put together, okay? And from that, and this is like a type of axle that is created, and these are tied with a barks type of thing. So that was the early primitive type of wheel. And again, so, and this was a fairly good size in diameter. You can see that this is, so, and this goes back to the Mesolithic era, okay? And again, it's like, and the other cultures, for example, I mean, Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, but in Stonehenge, how the logs were rolled over to bring the gigantic stones, from the quarry type thing. So this was the early attempts at some type of wheel transportation, okay? And this was another part that was discovered, that I don't know, I think I haven't been able to find the correct pronunciation, but I would say Bronosis, a part. This was a ceramic pottery that was discovered in Poland, and that is based on precise dating. It goes as far back as 3,370 before current era. And this was the earliest description of, you can just see here in the center, a wheeled vehicle. Okay, that small wagons, so carts, they were drawn by cattle. They were used in Central Europe, So this was 5,000 years ago. Okay, moving further back on, the earlier way would be, people would have been using, as we talked about, for Egyptian pyramid and for Stonehenge, this would be the way of using sledge, rolling logs type of thing. And from there, putting two and rolling things. So from rolling it, it didn't take too much of an imagination to go to two wheels and, dragging thing around. And this is a fixed axle and the wheels can rotate. But again, it was hard to steer type of thing. So it would be a difficult way to get around type thing. And you can see how this wooden wheel is, it's an H-shaped axle type of thing, okay. And so these were then grooves, and they both were rotating together. So there was a lot of friction, and turning around the corner was a more difficult part, okay. And so we had to wait until the Copper or Bronze Age type of thing, to get some real use out of it, But those were some of the earliest archaeological evidence. Again, when it comes to toys, these are the two pictures, that this one, sorry, you may not be able to read, but the picture on the left is with ceramic wheel with a bull figurine from Ukraine, going back to 4,000 before current era. And going to the east of Mesopotamia, this is from the Indus Valley civilization. So I had to look up this to see whether they were up to snuff or not, And yes, sure enough, that was, they had the bulls and the wheels And this is the Indus Valley, Harappan Valley, I think, and we talked about it in the class that I did on history of India. That was the Indus Valley civilization that was, in present day Pakistan, that was wiped out, probably most likely due to climate change. So this is varieties of cultures had their start. Okay, and again, moving back to the Sumerian metropolis of Uruk, there have been clay tablets that have been discovered with illustrating the four-wheel wagons. Okay, so this is, and so both the things like domestication of plants, animals, and this type of wheel innovation occurred around the same time. Okay, and again, so a lot of these were grooves that have been discovered, with the, in alluvial plains type of thing, with the H-type wheels, rolling boards, and so this is, and again, but these were not obviously very fast, and this were used for agriculture. The Celtic culture used it with iron reams and axle spoke and iron. Okay, so this was, some of the earliest attempts at, increasing speed in transportation, mostly for agriculture uses. Getting back to Sumerian culture, these are the wheels of war, the battle wagons and spoked wheels came into around. They were initially used by wild asses, later on to be used with the taming of horses. This brings us to around like 2500 before the current era. And you can just see that but these were heavy for war. They were not that useful because, they were like, several thousand pounds. And so, and then later on, this domestication inspired to the innovation of chariots as the mobility and speeds increased. And the Hittites and the Egyptians, they had one of the bigger battles called Battle of Kadesh that took place around 1200 before the current era, where a large number of chariots manned by archers with composite bows were used. So this was, so as human beings, they found a different type of use other than just for agriculture. So these are some of the historical foundations. And so these are some of the pictures of the chariots that we have come across. Okay, all right. And at the same time, the spoked wheels, so these are some of the diagrams going back to 2000 BC and how the charioteers, and these were fairly light, weight type thing. And the spoked wheels most likely would have developed in the steppes of Central Asia around 2000 before the current era. And some of the culture, the whole entire chariots have been buried along with the so-called noblemen, and they have been, and along with the horses and some of the goat things. So I once read a lot about archaeology when I was fascinated about the origin of human race type of thing. And so the whole entire chariots have were buried with obviously the leader of the clan, so to speak. And some of the graves which were discovered in the pit graves of something that is called Yamanya culture, that dates back to somewhere around Central Asia, Ukraine, Southern Russia area. So that dates back to about, said 2500 before the current era type of thing. So, and this is also before DNA culture became around. This goes back to something called the Kurgan culture, K-U-R, and culture. So if you look at some of the history of archaeology, this is what you would find type of thing as to. And getting back to the Hindu classic scripts, okay, and the so-called Aryan migration that took place in the Vedic culture, which dates back to, again, they were notorious that never wrote down anything. It was all oral culture. So, but depending upon some of the German scholars who literally translated and correlated timing, at time to around like 1500 before the current era. And there is no one text in Hindu tradition, but if one has to say, that is called Gita, which is the sermon that Lord Krishna gives to the warrior between the two tribes that have a warfare. And that was he could not fight, but he became the chariot racer. or like for example, and he gives, and then the warrior himself, Namarjuna, becomes, has a remorse. These are our brothers. Why we don't want to kill? I don't want to kill them. So he gives them the lesson of philosophy of karma. That is the message of Mahabharata, which is, ties in with the uh, equivalent to the epics of Iliad and Odyssey, in the Hindu Vedic culture type thing. So, but there again, chariots play a huge description, and the whole first chapter is so and so. This king is riding this type of chariot with this type of weapons, type of thing. So it's a fascinating history type thing. And obviously, so that's when Alexander reached, northern India again. So he met with elephants and chariots, from the other army. There was a land-based empire in the foothills of Himalayas, and so that took place. So that figured for it. But then somewhere along the line, they fell out of fashion because, for example, then the horses became this thing, and the Mongol culture, they had the smaller, more mobile horses. So, for example, the real men don't like ride chariots, so the horses became overpowerful, and a lot of the invasion that takes place from the Mongols, hordes, and so that the horses became popular. And somewhere along the line, around 1000 BC, chain brakes were introduced as part of the wheel. Okay, so and this again, that gives a lot more control and mobility type of thing, Okay, so it's a, and then there were other uses of wheel as well. You can see that this is around the water wheels were used. Some of the Chinese literature shows that they were used far more earlier than we realized, but that history did not translate too well to the East. Okay, and the Greeks also used it to grind grain, and this was groundbreaking type of thing. So the water wheels were used, for times immemorial. Okay, all right, and again, so these are getting back to the wheelbarrows where they used. The Chinese had built a wheelbarrow with large central wheel, where the entire load was mounted, easy to push around. Okay, and now one would think that this is such a brilliant idea, it would be well accepted. Wrong. Okay, when the West tried to enter Japan, the excavation was done with Japanese. Initially, refused to use wheelbarrows to haul anything all the way. Instead, they preferred using two baskets slung three on each side on the bamboo poles. Okay, so this was the time-honored way of doing things. So just because the idea is very practical does not mean it will be well accepted. And this just blows my mind type of thing as to how it was not that easily, welcome type of thing. And I think I even found a quote that even when the Brits they were building railways as late as 19th century in India, they offered wheelbarrows to the Indian, workers or laborers, and they preferred to carry the wheelbarrow on their head rather than use it for the purpose that it was intended to. So and that just floored me. I said, okay, well, now we are everything type of thing. So it was a more convenient way as to, and now, are there any physiological advantages of carrying things on the head? And even now, you find in several cultures, especially in Africa and even in desert type of India, that women can carry a lot of stuff on their head. So again, it depends upon the climate because the terrain is jungle type of thing. So it was difficult to say the wheel did not, get widely accepted all over the world, I think. So that was just, I thought there was some fascinating part of the history of the wheel type of thing. And of course, the spinning wheel has been around, that, and that, is there anything that that Da Vinci did not invent? I mean, that's just, I know, I think once I remember running into replica of Da Vinci inventions type of thing. So, and this is one of his inventions type of thing, self-propelled car, and you can see it's a fairly sophisticated device, with two symmetric and springs, while one would be enough to move the devices, and very sophisticated looking solution that he had proposed. Okay, so it's just, I mean, it's a true Renaissance invention type of thing as to where it didn't go any further. There was no mass production type of thing. And again, just to mention, the spinning wheels may have originated in India around, like 500 to 1000 current era, okay? Because, the plant and animal fibers were transferred into thread and yarn with spinning wheel. And then, again, the invention of clothing. So there are varieties of ways wheels have been utilized by humanity, okay? Now, before the cars, there was, this was fascinating that what other thing gave us the idea type of thing as to before the cars, this was one of the things, was something called the bone shaker, okay? And, oh, I'm sorry, I should go back on my right side first. This was something called the Swift Walker, okay? So this is a pedestrian hobby horse, basically. And there's a French name called a Dracine, or it's, I may butcher the name, it's called first Velocipede, okay? And it's called the Lauf Machine, Laufmachine. It's called the running machine. This was invented by a German, I think he was a baron of some sort, named Foster Karl Drais in 1857. So what it had was a pair of equally sized wheels. Okay, you can see that, which would top with a wooden beam. This is a replica of it. You can see the bottom image right here. Okay, and there are no pedals. Okay, the rider would sit aside and feet touching the ground and take long strides to get it moving. And you have to drag your legs along with it, type of thing. But, with this, he almost managed to go at like, double the walking speed, So this was and then again, it came into conflict with pedestrians type of thing because they would run into it type of thing. And then again, then somebody else came up later on with the idea of making the front wheel bigger, okay? And then slowly pedals came about. And this is actually, you can recognize these are the famous steps of the Capitol. Okay, you can just see this is, I mean, it takes some courage to get down with on this big wheel, wearing a nice little straw hat type of thing, So I think, this is an accident waiting to happen type of thing. So, this was, paddles and cranks came in a little later type of thing to drive the front axle. And this is the star that is descending the Capitol steps in 1884, providing one solution of the problem, large wheel and a small wheel for stability, okay? And again, this was just unreal as to how these inventions were utilized. But so this can be said that this is the forebear of automobiles, and okay. And from that, there are logical steps, and we talk about the early days of steam. And in 1679, a Flemish Jesuit in China invented steam type of mobility vehicle made for a toy for a Chinese emperor. Again, this was just like a proof of concept, so to speak. So you can say this was the first steam-powered engine. Then again, then the French were on the forefronts of this. For start, a French inventor named Nicolas Joseph Cugnot. He built the first self-propelled land-based steam vehicle. Okay, and then the steam carriages came about. Okay, and then later followed by steam tricycles, carriage, steam cars. So these were some of the various modes of transportation that came about, and you can just see that with the boiler, the steam engine. But they were not they were very heavy, and it had tendency to explode. So not the safest thing around type of thing. And then later on, people did use this. There were three modes of transportation that were being utilized. The internal combustion engine was a latecomer, so to speak, but the earlier ones were steam cars, with the invention of steam engines, by Stephenson and others in UK, in Britain. Okay, that this was one of the earliest application for using this. Okay, for transportation.
Bharat, excuse me, in the history of Tampa, the first gasoline-powered car was from a bicycle shop of Furman Bicycle in 1901. But you've just reminded me that in 1898, there were 6 steam cars in Tampa owned by the 6 wealthiest individuals. And apparently 3 years before the gasoline car first came on the streets of Tampa, Edward Monroe was apparently the chief financial officer of one of the big cigar companies and one of the wealthiest guys in town by far. And there are descriptions in Tampa's history of what would happen when he would drive that big steam car into the streets of Tampa because of the sound and the danger of exploding. I mean, it meant that he had to be a very powerful guy in order to get away with it, in order to demonstrate his and he had many nicknames in the streets of Tampa as far as that dragon, big bad monster, and the rich guy's hell device, I think were the nicknames.
Yeah. It used to frighten the heck out of horses. Okay, because they were sharing with horse carriages type thing. So it was one of the big testing as to that goes into the real testing as to, yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate it, that thing. And I think I actually quickly scanned on the Tampa Museum history, and I think they do have a demonstration model of type of thing at the museum, so I mean, I plan to visit that one of these days. I don't know how, but it may not be that thing, but it was, and they actually on their website, they have like a virtual tour, like a 360 view on their website, for Tampa Automobile Museum. And I think I did see one of these, type of thing. So whether it's a replica model of, or, I doubt it would be original, but it would be fascinating to see as to how varieties of modes were explored. And these were nothing to be sneezed at. Some of these that later on the Stanley steamers and other state came about. They were able to capture, there was a record that was placed by something called Stanley steamer, about more than 100 miles per hour. So it was, they were serious people type of thing, okay. And this was, by the way, that I put too many images on, but this is an example of something called the omnibus, okay. And that became, and this is a fascinating story about how this was originally, afterwards, after the era of riding horses and war, the carriages became very popular, and the rich in Europe started owning carriages. But those were, toys for rich. But somewhere along the line, the idea to democratize the process, okay, and none other than Pascal, okay. For those of you who are mathematicians and physics buffs, would remember the name Pascal, okay. He was a mathematician and a polymath, and at the same time, I think you may know that for the existence of God, for those of you who are philosophy buffs may remember, there is something called the Pascal's wager, okay. So there is nothing to be lost by not believing in God, okay. You're not going to go wrong by believing. If he's not there, you haven't lost anything. So that's called, it's a philosophical thing. But and he was given the charter or something for manning omnibus carriages in France. So there were like minimal charges type of thing. And this was the way, that was how the common people could mix role with the middle class who were riding the omnibuses. So that was one way. And this was regulated fare, and the fare was called commuted fare. Okay. So that's how the name commuter came about. So that was the mixture of the middle class tradesmen and other people with the people who are the working class stiffs, so to speak, So that's how the word commuter came into existence. Yeah, but and then this type of omnibuses, you can just see the ad for Lipton tea from the Empire type of thing. So it's a fascinating image. I thought you'd enjoy sharing that. Okay, and at the same time, this was absolutely hilarious type of thing. The Great Stink, and this was obviously, the U.S. followed a few years later, but this was the big testing as to during hot weather and the horses and manure. I mean, the same problem that we are facing with automobiles, about pollution and bad air and the noise, I just live close to Bruce B. Down, and the noise and especially in winter is just interesting type thing. I think I've learned to block it out, but it's an interesting thing now type thing since they've expanded the road. But so these were the same problems more than 130 years ago. okay, and dear Father Thames, and this was the days when before Pasteur, you know, and so this was the days of miasma type thing, and the raw sewage was flowing in the streets, and so this was it wasn't the walking on the street was not for the faint-hearted type of thing, and this led to the development of the sewage system in England, so type of thing, and the various embankments and drainage facilities were drawn. Victoria, Chelsea, Albert embankment. By this time, they had thousands of carriages type of thing, and there were as many as 50,000 horses. Each horse would have a 15 to 30 pound of excrement. Okay, so you can just see the amount of manure in the storage facility, and so this was in terms of horse ownership. In UK, it was 1 in 10 person owned a horse. Okay, United States, well, obviously, even at that time, US was richer than Britain. 1 in 4 person owned a horse. So you're talking about 20 million horses. So, and they would need a tons of fodder to feed, So 1/3 of the farm area would have to be reserved to grow fodder for the horse. So this is, and just to make the matters more interesting, there was an epidemic of equine influenza at that time. So this was and all the newspapers had, including the respectable New York Times, had this thing, the problem is getting out of hand, there was a lot of solution has to be found for this problem, for the health, as to how many people were getting sick from the flies, and then again, obviously, the horses, and to where to put all this muck, as they used to call it, that, and the Victorians, didn't call it by proper name. And so it was becoming a major issues in all the major cities of Western Europe and in Eastern United States as well.
Bharat,
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
did you say 20,000 horses?
Uh,
Did I misunderstand you?
no, this is even a much larger sum type of thing. So I mean, I talk about in one city type of thing. No, they're
Yeah.
like, close
Oh,
to
my.
50,000 type of thing. Yeah. Okay. And in all over the country type of thing, there were as many as 20 million type of thing. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, all over the country. So those numbers were staggering, to put it partly type of thing, and depending upon different countries. So, and so we talked about the steam powered trolleys, and the earliest days of steam engine, that goes back to, the great inventor, Thomas Newcomen in 1712. Okay. And then, so by this time, the other thing that was in the running was electric transport. The batteries were invented a lot earlier, type of thing. By 1880, electricity and was being utilized as for transportation. For electric cars were in the vogue, and some enterprising Belgium in 1899, a guy named Camille Genetzi, had made an electric car, and that was able to travel at 100 kilometers per hour. Okay, so these were, all three things were in the running, not just internal combustion engine type of thing. So okay, and this is, again, this takes us, I just thought this was a very interesting timeline type thing. Let's see if I can zoom in on type of thing. Okay, escape. Okay, and this gives us from 1886. Okay, yeah, let me go like this. Yeah, okay, yeah, the first car was invented, and then we'll talk about 1911 electric ignition car. Okay, coil spring suspension, Ford Model T. Okay, and this is when I'll have slides to fit each part, but I just thought this was a nice way of pictorially entering the timeline type of thing. It just, hopefully once I've modified, you can just see it all along, and brings us all the way up to the present date type thing. So this was a nice historical timeline in one clean swipe. Okay, and okay, now this brings us to which side people drive on type of thing. Okay, as to the driving, dates back to the Roman era, because the Romans drove on the right side of the road, because most of the people were right-handed. So, if you're likely to be attacked, you want to make sure that your right hand is free, okay, type of thing. So that was, that was one of the ways type of, uh, uh, okay, the ways that which side of driving came around into existence. Okay, just a second, I think. Okay, and now, and so we already talked about, how far back steam was in vogue. Okay, and then interestingly enough, as far back as 1807, somebody had even used hydrogen-powered internal combustion engine. This was tried. So again, and then by 1794, petroleum was being used, and this goes back to the early days of invention of physics of heat. And the well-known science inventor named Sadie Carnot, who had discovered the principle of heat as how much work is produced, with heat. And the early days of thermodynamics, were coming into existence. And this, because people knew what steam was, but they had not figured out. But Sadie Carnot who died young at 32. He was one of the earlier ones who had, brought some physics, and in the early days of thermodynamic science were introduced by that time. Okay. Now, when it comes to internal combustion engine, the French were the pioneers in this. Okay, and a lot of the earlier steam automobile cars were invented in France. And let's see if I can zoom in on this part. Okay, and you can just see how this is the timeline that goes back to the highlight dating back to 1769. Okay, I already mentioned the guy named Nicolas Joseph Cugnot, and then electrical carriage, they came around in Scotland, and then gets back to the more present day. The official, if you look at Wikipedia or something, the invention of cars, as we know it, is credited to Carl of Frederick Benz and Daimler, more or less at the same time, type of thing. And then other inventions were, but never went into production. So they never got the credit for it, because they were a few years earlier, but they did not go into real production. So what if you had to ask in one sentence, the earlier inventions would have to be, the credit has to go to Daimler and Benz. Okay. Now, this is interesting as to how the name Mercedes came about. Okay, Mercedes-Benz is a combination of two names. A Mercedes had nothing to do with Benz. The name traced back to Mercedes Jelinek. Okay, now comes to idea who was Jelinek. Jelinek was a car dealer, and to the chagrin of Germans, he was Jewish. Okay, and he loved his daughter, and his daughter, and he had made his money in Spanish colonies in Morocco, and so when he got involved in management of the company, he was brought in by the chief engineer Maybach. Okay, and then that's when he selected the name Mercedes for the first car. He got the right to pick the name. That's how the name came about. So he named the cars after his daughter, Mercedes Jelinek, whose Spanish name translates to mercy. And she lived, she died, in 1929, but the name stuck. So this was, and the company that was founded by Carl Benz and Gottlieb Wilhelm Daimler. And so that was part of the Daimler Motor and Gesellschaft, DMG. So that was the company that was Daimler Benz. But that's how the name Mercedes came into existence. Okay, and this was one of the, even before that, the real credit goes back to a guy who is lost to in history, a Frenchman named de Rivaz. And you can see he was way far ahead in 1807. Okay, he was a retired army officer, and he invented the first primitive internal combustion engine. It was powered, yes, I mean, this almost fell out of chair when I saw that. It was powered by a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. manually ignited by electrical spark. Okay, but there was, this was very primitive. It did not involve compression or crankshaft or connecting rod. So it was, but at least you can say that this was one of the earliest attempt of using, some type of internal combustion with pressure type of thing. Okay, and so this was, it goes back about at least 70 years before Carl Benz. Okay. Now, at the same time, the other things that were coming to hand, just you could not have timed it better, was the invention of we're not talking about the history of petroleum, but this was one of the earlier starts, the famous well, for uh, for those of you who are interested now, Richard Rhodes, who got award for history of oil. This is a 20, 30-year-old book type of thing, but the history of oil industry that was fascinating about, and talks about the earliest wells. We're in Pennsylvania, Edwin Drake, 1857, okay, and located 3 miles south of the famous Titusville, okay. So this was the start of discovery of petroleum, and that just opened up the floodgates type of thing. And this had a lot to do with the ultimate winning entry of internal combustion engine type thing, because as we'll see that it was, the oil as well has been known to mankind since time immemorial. The Persians used it in Azerbaijan. They were, naturally occurring, lighted fuel, and even the Chinese used it type of thing. So it's been around, but this was some of the first systematic way. And then by this time, the earlier purification processes were taking place for kerosene and other types of fuels, But the discovery of oil wells in the United States gave a big, boost to the car industry as we know it. And again, and this was at the same time, at the time of the San Francisco earthquake, the Standard Oil gave away free gasoline during the San Francisco earthquake. And so that again made a very useful impact on for the petroleum-based transport winning out. Okay, and this was the famous dawn of the internal combustion engine. I think we're coming up to 2 o'clock, so we probably should take about 5-minute break before we get into the story of the real start of internal combustion engine. So I will pause my recording and we can join in about 5 minutes type of thing. Okay, I can get a sip of water or something. And okay, let's see if I can pause it. Oops. Pause recording. All right, this brings us to the real story of cars as we know it, which start with Bertha Benz, okay, and she was born in 1849. She married Carl Benz a few years later in 1872, and he was a very self-taught engineer, and on his own, he was working on the internal combustion engine. Around the same time, two other guys, were working also, Maybach and Daimler type thing. And then I don't know, being an engineer, he was very meticulous. He was just working on in his front yard type of thing. And then Bertha Benz, obviously she was a smart lady. And on August 5th, 1888, she decided, to take off, that he was not sure that this thing was ready for roads or not. Okay. But she decided it was ready. So she decided to visit her mom, who lived 66 miles away, and along with that, she knew enough about his invention that it wasn't powerful enough to go uphill. So she took two of her sons to push things along up the hills, and also to help as a fixing on the road. Okay, and so this was, and Carl did not know what she was up to, so she drove at like 25 miles per gallon, 1.3 tank, but they had wooden brakes, and then obviously, as expected with the first ride, she had some difficulty, but she was resourceful enough. She was able to fix the belts that were broken with her hat pin and her own garter. Okay. And at the same time, she kept informing him of her progress, with telegrams. Okay. And, by this time, this was making the newspaper type of thing. And the police were not too happy with this thing because, this was something totally novel, that thing. And so this was one of the first car ride, and she successfully, and obviously there were no gas station, so she had to get fuel at the local pharmacies, and obviously there was easy enough to get water type thing because there was nothing like a water cooled engine, but she was savvy enough, and this was the original start, I think so. And then the company that was started was called Daimler MG, Daimler Mercedes, was started. And unfortunately, Daimler died at 1892. Maybach, died a few years later. And so this was, and then there were usual investor difficulties. So all the original inventors were slowly eased out by other investors. I mean, it's more or less the same thing that happened with Tesla to some extent. And so the Daimler and Benz, they merged in 1926. And the rest is history type of thing. And at the same time, not to be outdone, the French were big, and Peugeot was a big manufacturer at that time, and they did several modifications in the car. The inventor named Levasseur introduced water-cooled radiator, moved the engine to the front, and that's the car as we come to know it. And this was this era between 1890 and 1910 was really, one could say, this is the rise of the modern world as we know it. And in Europe, it was described as La Belle Époque. Okay, and that's so that's we can just say that's the. Now we can see what else was happening at that time. Nietzsche was writing the Antichrist at that time. And just to refresh your memory, this was only about 30, 40 years after Darwin. At the same time, in art, Monet and other impressionists were making this thing. On the physics front, none other than the greatest physical discovery was being made. The great Maxwell had formed his equations. And not to be outdone, a fellow named Karl Marx had written his mammoth work. And this was, again, Freud was proposing, his theories at that time. So this was, one can say this is the rise of the modern age as we come to know it, I think. So it's just, nobody could have planned this better, but it just worked out that way, that all these things occurred more or less in the same 10 various disciplines. Okay. And then this is a lesser known figure, there was a guy named Siegfried Marcus. Okay. And he was an inventor par excellence. He had varieties of patents, but never applied for patent for motor car. So this was another pearl inventor. And so this was the rise of France type thing, And at the same time, one name that you may recognize was Renault. He started making cars in 1899 in France. Okay. And this is now, again, there comes around Siegfried Marcus, who was one of the inventors, he has been written out of the history with the rise of, Nazi Germany. They had actually instructions in 1940 to remove his name, was as to a part of the discovery of, internal combustion engine. So, and these were earlier exhibits, as far back as 1864 in Vienna, and even before Daimler and Benz in 1875. So, but again, he has been removed from the history because of his background. Okay, and this was, the Maybach and Daimler's car, they were put together, and you can see there was several years later, I think, and these were relatively, weak powered horse car. And I already talked about how the name came about with Mercedes, because she was the daughter of the dealer, Emil Jelinek. Okay. And again, we alluded to a little bit about a slide or two about the electrical cars. And this were, the 100-mile electric cars. You can see the history would have been totally different if that had caught on. A French chemist, named Oliver Fritschel, an electrical engineer, became, they decided to build first electrical cars and set up production in Denver, Colorado. Okay. And again, so this were, more alike by women. Okay. Because they were easier to start. They did not have the top starter, this thing that was there. Okay. So this was a viable proposition, type of thing. But they were not cheap, as you can see, that these were sold for like $2,000, which is substantial pocket change for that time. So that was the cost was a factor along with that. Okay, and you can say that if electrical cars, and there are varieties of other companies that I want a couple of more slides. There are at least half a dozen companies that were making the electrical cars, and and they were fairly reliable type of thing. But electrical car demise was put out by another electrical device, which I alluded to, if you recall from that timeline slide that I showed you, was the electrical starter. Okay, when the internal combustion engine got the electrical motor starter that was invented by an engineer working for, I think it was for General Electric, and I'm sorry, for General Motors, named Charles Kettering. And so that eliminated the tough hand crank that you may have seen from Laurel and Hardy movies, where you had to turn the crank, or and so that put electrical cars more or less out of business. And they were also, and this is the advertisement from that era type of thing. You can see that this is a contented woman. This is by a Babcock Electrical Company, out of New York. Okay, she can. I mean, this is absolutely hilarious when you read it, type of thing. She can take her friends for an exhilarating ride to the park, shopping. Okay, and this was, so this was free from dirt, and it was nice for dainty ladies type thing. So it's particularly suitable for women. Clean, reliable, did not require any mechanical expertise to operate. Okay, so this was, and even so much so that the great pioneer himself, Henry Ford, bought one for his wife, Clara Ford. Okay, and then varieties of companies, and he had even started a venture for the electrical car manufacturing in combination with none other than the great Thomas Alva Edison. Okay, but a lot of this actually, when the internal combustion engine got the better start, they fell out of favors, and some of them had fairly impressive speed, that range that they could achieve, almost up to 100 to 200 miles type thing. So, but that's history as to how they never caught on, type of thing. And now this is an interesting day as to it shows the varieties of companies that were prominent in each country. I think, let's see if one can zoom in. And and on the other side, now the name Bugatti, you'd think that it's Italian name, but it's actually French. Then Citroën, we'll talk more about it. Peugeot and Renault, these are the big French companies that are still very much in. On the German side, there are varieties of companies that are still, they're starting with 1926, Mercedes-Benz, and others were even older, but they've become part. There's been a lot of mergers that have taken place, and some of the names that came about, they're familiar with all of us at the present time. Okay, getting back to the US and UK, Okay, now all of these names, we all recognize it, especially for the American side. but some of the British names have, may not be as familiar with all of you. Aston Martin and Bentley may be familiar with James Bond fans. Land Rover is still around, and only a few or three, and okay, and these are the dates when they got started, type thing. Now, when did the automobile get started in the United States? The credit for that goes to two brothers, named Charles and Frank Durea. And they started, they were, again, a lot of these people transitioned from bicycle repair to cars. And they start, and Massachusetts, their start was in just a few years after Carl Benz, sometime in 1891. Okay. And at the same time, a lot of people who are working in blacksmith and other bicycle industry were, getting into this was, there were a lot of these people were self-taught type thing. The one name that's worth mentioning is a guy with the unusual name of Ransom Olds, and he was a son of a blacksmith. He started out, building internal combustion engine on his own, sometime in Lansing, Michigan. And his car actually survived and became part of the General Motors. And again, I alluded to as to why the British drive on the left, because just to free the right hand type of thing, And again, this goes back to the Roman era type thing. So, and again, which side the driver sits, that is important. So if you are near the road, you get better view of the road in the middle of the road type of thing. So that's it. And again, so that goes back to the ancient times as to how, the positioning was selected.
And Barat, you knew that Ransom Olds is why we have Oldsmar, and Oldsmar was for Oldsmobile division of General Motors' employees when they would retire would come down to the large acreage that he bought that is now Oldsmar.
Oh, yeah, I did not know that. Thank you. So I think, it's nice to have a Florida historian type. I've heard of Oldsmar, but I did not know that it had to do with, and I think, they both had, places in Fort Myers, if I'm not mistaken, Henry Ford and Edison. I think, so their summer play, their winter place was over in Fort Myers.
They were right next to each other.
Right, exactly. So yeah, so it says, I have a picture later on coming on for them, that thing. So of this. Okay. Okay. On the British side, there were two totally different people that, the one company that, I think we'll have to mention is the most expensive cars, Rolls, okay, was a rich, came from a rich family, had gone to Eton School and Trinity College, okay. At the same time, he teamed up with a young Royce, who came from an humble background, but he was a superb engineer. And these two met together and started the company. And they wanted to make a quality product, and that's still around, okay. And there was a start of the two different people type thing. They're under and along with that, so this was one, and this started fairly early, I should say, somewhere around 1907. Okay, so this is one of the few British companies that's still around, type of thing. Okay. And then the earlier cars were the Playboy for the rich. Basically, it was a toy for the rich type of thing. Okay, and you can see this was a character in the Mr. Todd stories and The Wind in the Willows, an embodiment of the reckless, inconsiderate upper class motorist. Okay, all right, and so this was the cartoon that was from the famous novel. And there is, and this was again the peaceful coexistence was hard to live with, hard to accomplish, because these automobiles in the early days, they frightened the horses, because these were like toys for the rich people, because they were quite expensive in the early days, and that and again, there are no rules of the road, so the chickens were frightened and run over, and so there was a big gulf that developed between the haves and the have not, the poor farmers and the wealthy drivers. Okay, and this is again blows my mind. La Figaro, the French newspaper, told the story of automotive chicken, which was specially bred by farmers to rush in front of cars, so the owners could be came 5 francs in compensation. Okay, and there again, the American wealthy, who is who, were going over to Europe and importing cars, and none other than one of the Vanderbilt heirs, named William Vanderbilt Jr. He was a tricycle owner, motor tricycle owner that he imported from France, and even in Europe, he was, he was almost going to be lynched. Basically, he killed several dogs, and people were out to get him, so to speak. But then he was, freed by the police type thing. So, and this is again, shows this a figure of the time, that there was a Red Flag Act in Britain, that a man was supposed to walk in front of automobile carrying a red flag. Okay. Now, how fast that would go, that is, your guess is as good as mine. But there was the road called the red flag law. And the automobile enthusiasts, were obviously protesting it, but the law stayed into effect for several years, actually. And that probably slowed down the development of automobiles in Britain, because a lot of them were imported from France. Okay, but there was actually a red flag law that was passed.
Ron,
So this was it.
I believe the statistics in New York City in 1920 and 1921 were such that the post-war sales of automobiles were such that the number of deaths by automobile were in the thousands. Even though the town may have only been hundreds of thousands, the deaths were in the thousands from automobiles, as far as people not knowing how to react to their first automobile, because there was no such red flag law in the U.S.
Oh yeah, no, there wasn't. No, there was none in U.S. No, this is just strictly for Britain. It was not in Germany nor in France, type of thing. It was only Britain was, that thing. So this is, but that's no. You're absolutely right. There's nothing in the United States, that thing. So, and again, at the same time, we have some points coming across about the roads. The European roads were a lot in better condition than American roads. So it was a different scenario type of thing as to how, because this was. So the road conditions were also had a lot to do with, perhaps the higher accident rates type of thing, because the French roads were the best in all of Western Europe, and they, for at the start of the automobile, in this thing. And again, so this is, this just goes right to the front. This was the first death took place. A guy named Henry Bliss. This was as early as 1899, so this was in New York City, I think. And then a lot of children, obviously this was the days of early immigration, and so this was a lot of kids used to die this thing. So I don't think, for those of you who are interested, can click on this link, but this is, it's always the jinx when I try to open the link type of thing, because it's hard to go back to the original this thing, Okay, but these are some of the things that for those of you who are more curious, I put in the links type of thing. And you can see how this looks like, this looks straight out of Bombay from when I was growing up type of thing. Anybody who has been to India, at least, back in the 70s and 80s, when I left, I mean, this was the chaotic scene type of thing, So, and it's still, so this is just, and yes, even when I was growing up, there was, the trolley car, or trams as we call it, that was introduced by the Brits in Bombay. So they were still, very much there until, I should say, probably 1960s and 70s. So they were, they stuck around for a long time. Yeah. And there were several protests, I think, and in New York City, in 1 year there were 1,000 children were killed, I think. So. And so there was rightly so, there were public outcry that took place in National Safety Council. And there were, women, obviously, the mothers took to streets, and there were Black deaths at each funeral in Baltimore. And there were a huge mass movement about protest against this Wild West scene, except instead of horses, this was with automobiles. Okay, let's see. And again, this is an interesting character, like I think, now, I don't know if Nick may know more about it, because it was from Carmel, Indiana. Okay, it has more roundabouts than anywhere else in the country. that was an interesting trivia. I've been through Carmel, Indiana type of thing on no, and I don't know if I missed that or not, but at least that's one of the few places that has 125 roundabouts. Okay, and this is now thinking out now. You can clarify that roundabouts are different than traffic circles. Because there's no stop light, I don't stop and yield. And actually, that's a very nice device because it has dramatic reduction in number of accidents that takes place. In France, there may be as many as 30,000, roundabout. US is somehow, has never caught on too much type of thing. Some cities are making this thing, and this was an interesting guy. This was he made the, I'm sorry, a guy named William Phelps Eno. He was a wealthy businessman, and he decided to do something about these deaths, that were taking place. So he made something like a rules of the road. Okay, he was, it was called the, father of traffic management, so to speak. That devised the hand signals, they keep to the left, and he did not himself own the car, by the way, type thing. So this was some of the formulas that he came up with, type thing about the traffic patterns, okay. And so an interesting person who did a lot for this thing. Now, at the same time, the car manufacturers, they decided, okay, that instead of regulating things, we need to educate the people. So that's where the word jaywalking came about, type of thing, listening to efforts to restrict itself in order to prevent efforts to restrict speed, okay, type of thing. Industry lobbying for freedom. Again, you can just see that this went around. So there were a lot of fights that went on between the pedestrians versus this thing. And now by this time, the car market had penetrated to a huge extent, especially on the West Coast. And LA came to be identified as car city type of thing. And so this is do not help to allow Cincinnati. Well, okay, to motorists, welcome to motorists. So this was fighting traffic. American city required not only physical change, but also social one. City should be reconstructed for the sake of motorists. The streets had to be socially reconstructed where cars can belong, So it was, was a big confrontation between that took place, how the street users struggle to define who actually owns the street type of thing. So the transition era, one can say it lasted between 1910 to 1930. Okay, so between the people who prefer to walk, and so these were varieties of. So don't be a jaywalker. So these were some of the campaigns that were devised. I think they're absolutely hilarious. In Brooklyn, wonderful. Okay, a graduate jaywalker. Okay, the plaintiff has been proven guilty of jaywalking, and is not entitled to mileage. Okay, so don't be a jaywalker. So this is varieties of newspaper publications that took place, things. So yeah. So some of the images are just, and this were the rules for driving on the rebuilding the street traffic. You can just see how varieties of laws were passed as to how one should turn, how vehicles should cross from one side to the other. So there were efforts at regulating, the way things were carried out. Okay, and the battle just continued between the horseless carriage versus the touring car. So the varieties of manufacturing that took place, some of the engines were rear mounted with not just a steering wheel, like a tiller type of thing, and then the other types were, two-seated front mounted cover engines. This was for shorter trips versus longer trips. There were two, I think. And the earliest one was Oldsmobile Curve Dash. Okay, and the idea it was called curve because to prevent the mud and the muck from the horses spraying you type of thing. Okay, so this was some of the earlier vehicles that it came into mention. At the same time, the problem came about with what type of tires would be sold. And that brings us to the enterprising, brothers, Eduardo Michelin and Andre Michelin. So this was in 1899. They were actually farm implementers. And then some cyclists came to for pneumatic tire almost glued to the rim. Okay. And it was very time-consuming process to remove and read this thing. So that's when they overall devised the air-filled tire and tube this thing. And this was their a famous logo that was devised, Nunc ad bibendum. Okay. Right. And so this was okay. Let's see. I think so. And then they stuck around, and they're still, and they were ahead of their time. They, took out the first patent for removable pneumatic tire. Okay. And that went on to become the first long distance race. Now, the way to popularize automobiles, racing was one of the first ways for general public came to know about automobiles. And that created the excitement. The earlier races were held in Europe. Similarly, Chicago Tribune held the race in United States, and that generated a massive excitement. And obviously, it was like a Wild West. Not all of them were able to finish the race, and some of the awards were initially rather small, but then the awards for the racing became larger and larger. And now this is interesting that they had actually organized a race, from Paris to San Francisco, all the way across Asia type of thing. And a few people did actually finish this, So some of the races were not for the faint-hearted. Now, at the same time, like this is one of the lesser well-known car manufacturer in the early days was a guy named Citroën. And he introduced advertising. As you can see that back in 1920s, he hired the Eiffel Tower, for his ad. And that stayed in. And this was so powerful that even when Lindbergh was flying in, he was able to see the ad. So this was like thousands of light bulbs to light up the great Eiffel Tower. So this was one of the, okay. And it's a very fascinating story about what happened to him because, again, with the rise of the Nazi Germany, he was Jewish. So he was run out of business type of thing, and a large number of his family members succumbed to the Nazi horror. Okay. On the American side, we already talked about, this was Ransom Olds, who lived from 1865 to 1950, and this was his car. Okay. And this was, again, you can see the price was not small. And this is interesting that he did not like to reverse the car. So in Lansing, Michigan, he had built for himself a turntable garage. So he can just drive basically out type of thing. And he did. He was his big house in Lansing. That is, it's been kept as a historical site in Lansing, Michigan. Okay. All right. And now on the British side, they were a little late in arrival, but then it gradually got down to business. The earlier ones were again, a bicycle and mechanics type of people. The founder of that was a guy named Henry Austin, and other inventor was a guy named Morris. Okay. And so these were the two big British car manufacturers, Austin and Morris. And I'm sure, and they stayed in the business for several decades. Okay. And I already alluded to in 1906, Henry Royce and Charles Rolls, decided to make the in Rolls-Royce. On the American side, some of the other names which are lesser known was a guy named Henry Leland, who had fallen apart with Henry Ford, and he started a company which you may be familiar with. It's called Cadillac, and it was named after the founder of Detroit. Okay, and so this was, some varieties of characters, were involved in the early history. Okay. All right. And now, and at the same time, there was a coach maker named Studebaker. Okay. And they gradually marketed from coaches into car manufacturing. And again, not all of them were very successful, because after Studebaker's, one of the founder of Studebaker's was a guy named Alberto Erskine. And some of these were, and during the Depression, his company had failed, so much so that he committed suicide. And now one character that needs to be brought in mind was a guy named William Crapo Durant. And he was not an engineer by himself, but he was a wheeler dealer who consolidated a lot of these small companies and led to the foundation of other big corporations, General Motors. And it's an interesting story that he started out, and with a relatively small involvement, in 1860s from $2,000, and he became a multimillionaire. Okay, type thing. And in the end, when he died, he was down to $200. Okay, and he was a very imaginative person, but was a poor businessman to begin with, and he bought and sold companies, really fast trader, and he's the one who started the idea of dealership across the United States. As opposed to and he was, it can be said, was the founder of General Motors. And I'll have several slides to talk about General Motors later on, type of thing. Okay, and these were some of the earlier advertisement campaigns, type of thing that went on. And these were some of the foundations of Cadillac, that's still in Detroit. Okay. And some of the earlier manufacturers that were there for, this is the great Chevrolet, okay, who was a race car driver, came in from France, and he had started his company that later on got absorbed by General Motors. Okay. And this was some of the earlier advertisement that was done during the so-called Gilded Age as to how to appeal to the people's sense of luxury. Okay. And that brings us to the man who can be said started the modern age as we know it. That's Henry Ford. He was the son of a farmer, and he initial companies, he was not very successful. His first three endeavors failed, and finally, he decided, I will build the motor car for the great multitude. One has to say he must have read Walt Whitman to use the word multitude at that time, and he started out with an investment of somewhere around 20,000 or so, a considerable sum considering the time. Okay, and after the initial failure, he was down to his last $300, and then successfully, then after he decided to build his models name them in a very simple way, from A to Z. Okay, but then finally hit the jackpot with Model T. Okay, and that was. And that was what everyone has said. This was the start of a car for the common man in the United States as we know it. Okay. Initially worked with Edison Company. He made quadricycle four-wheel cars. Initial two companies failed. And in 1903, and then it took him about 4 or 5 years type of thing to come up with the product. Okay. And so this, and he started racing as a marketing tool was used, type of thing. So again, and so this was the first successful production that took place. And by 1906, he was making up to 25,000. And gradually by 1923, production had gone up to 3.1 million. Okay. And again, and this was, you can say that by that time, he naturally controlled the entire market. It was a weird looking car type of thing. It's, it almost looked like something, a small, this thing, like for a tall passenger box. It was easy to fix, and various accessories were sold by Sears for this thing. And the production continued from early 1900s to as long as 1927. Okay. And by that time, just about, the prices had dropped dramatically. As a person, there is a lot to be said for him, even though he was one of the most successful manufacturers, you can say that he was, a strong anti-Semite, and had continued to be so. I'll have a lot more to say about him as we go along, type of thing. And even as late as 1939, he had sent a check to Adolf Hitler on his birthday. Okay, and I think probably in the 1939 or something, somewhere around that time. And he had accepted an award from Nazi Germany. So it was a very checkered career, to put it mildly. Okay. And this is, I said that, he was friends with the who is who of the American inventors at that time. This is his picture with Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone, the great tire manufacturer. Okay. And he was born in 1863. Out of a large family, as they used to have in those times. His father was a prosperous farmer, okay, and had early schooling for about 8 years, but obviously great mechanical aptitude, okay. And again, started out with repairing watches, setting up a small machine shop, steam engines, okay. And then he finally established a position in Detroit, working as a night engineer for Edison Electric Company, okay. And he was their chief engineer for a while, okay, and developed what was known as a quadricycle at that time, as you can see in the image. Okay. Right. And the greatest idea was, the assembly line. These are the famous pictures of this thing, okay. And the biggest thing was no need to stop, standardized parts, okay. And again, from taking 12 hours to build one car, they lowered the time down to 93 minutes. That's almost mind-boggling, one can say, type thing. And some of the largest complexes that were done were in Detroit, and the famous River Rouge plant that became full-scale automobile production. Okay, and this was, and started out from raw materials onward, the supply chain. He entirely owned.
Peggy, come on. Yeah.
And he owned the entire supply chain, as I will talk about, basically. So type of thing. So with the raw material entered at one end and the finished car going out at the other end. So that's just mind-boggling as to what he was able to accomplish. Now, this is something that, he hired a guy that I think those with the more business background can talk more about Taylorism. Okay, I think if either Kevin or Bruce has more to say about Taylorism, you can chime in, please. So I will grant the floor to you. Okay. Are you?
I never heard of Taylorism, sorry.
Oh, okay, all right, yeah. So that Taylor, he was an engineer who actually had gone to Phillips Exeter and was accepted for Harvard, but then decided to work with his hand, in various factories and other things. And obviously was smart enough. He worked for Bethlehem Steel, and then later on from the scientific method of manufacturing and testing. So these are development of a true science in manufacturing, how to select workers, scientific education and training of workers, cooperation between managers and workers. These are the 4 principles, but he wrote a book and basically, said how the manufacturing could be streamlined and put on a scientific basis as to how the factory can be, used. So this was the early rise of Taylorism, which was considered, and Henry Ford adopted that in his manufacturing practices. And so this was the new way of, streamlining production. You can say that this was the rise of industrial age on gigantic American scale. And so this was basically, so Ford extended it to further people, the workers did not have to be specially trained for skilled electrician or skilled mechanic or so on and so forth. They could be standing in the place doing exactly the same work, repetitive work over and over again, shift after shift. And the biggest advantage that they had was a huge pull of immigrants pouring in from Central and Eastern Europe type of thing. So they had cheap labor available type of thing. And so they were willing to work, this mind-numbing work at that time. And a lot of them were supervised by native-born Americans. So you can see that how, even though they were all, white, but that was the whole this thing. So, and the retention thing was initially he needed as many as 13,000 employees, but he had to recruit and go through because only 1 out of 4 basically stayed in the job. So that's when he came up with the first idea of raising the wage, of doubling the wage, basically. And that again incentivized people to stick with this, routine work that they had to do. Okay. And the idea of Taylorism, which was a concept of industrial manufacturing, was adopted by Ford. And that was further extended by the great imitators out east who challenged their empire, Toyotism, just-in-time supply chain. So this whole idea has been carried on further and further. And at the same time, and you can see that various economists were proposing the ideas to, their class distinction was becoming more and more apparent. And the famous economist named Thorstein Veblen had written the theory of leisure class. You can see how, again, these were the ways of industrial giants, like the Vanderbilts and the Morgans, okay? And again, at the same time, the workers were working without any big unionization, and they were working long hours in poor conditions. Obviously the same thing. This was not just true just for automobile industry, but was also true in meat packing plants. And in fact, one can say that the assembly line idea was borrowed from the meat packing plants by Henry Ford, one could say. And again, it's like even as recently as when I was there in Green Bay, there were a lot of meat packing plants, and those who worked there were a lot of the Mexican immigrant who traveled and there was nothing to sneeze at because there are a lot of trauma with the fast-moving knives. So it's so the culture has not changed dramatically. You can see that and so the whole idea of assembly line, was got their start earlier, from the Chicago, stockyards, and was extrapolated into automobile. So and so at the same time, he proposed the idea of the economics of the theory of the leisure class, and again, this was extended in Europe by Karl Marx. And this is interesting that this is some of you may have read about this book that just came out recently. This was reviewed, and it's it's a very well-reviewed book written by a woman who is actually an artist. Okay, and during COVID shutdown, she wrote the book about how the same concept is going on about the time management, with Amazon workloads, and as to how everything is time. And this is I just read this book just last weekend type of thing. And it's fascinating as to how they would time how long it takes for a worker to punch in a card for entry, basically. I mean, like 0.12 second to take the card out of your pocket, to insert it into the slot. I mean, this is, and this is again, at the same time, there's a risk that you're going to be replaced by robots. And so this book goes back from the so-called, she uses the word like European colonialism, which not only extended to Asia and Africa, but also you can say colonization of the United States, because we had the frontier, which was wide open. Obviously, Native Americans did not count, so to speak. So expanding westward, so there was the idea of further this thing, and it was initially powered by horses and wagons, later on by automobiles, during the Great Migration. So she writes the same idea that is going on being extrapolated, So we went from horse and buggy to automobiles and electricity to now to the electronic type of thing. And this is how the time management. So it's a very, and she kind of drifts, basically, she talks about artist friends type of thing, going to the philosophy of Henry Bergson, to talking about time management and workers' rights as to how you can be doing mind-numbing work type of thing. And even same thing again for coding. So she prompts her book along the like driving along in Silicon Valley type of thing. So it's an interesting book type of thing, a little disjointed, I thought, but it's a worthwhile thing as to how valuable time is, as to how to earn a living type of thing. Now, moving back to the man in question type of thing, that he not only employed a lot of the immigrants who got off the FOB, fresh off the boat, okay, but he also tried to Americanize them or Fordize them, basically, if you prefer, while teaching them how to speak English properly. And the classes were mandatory. The instruction were by practical examples. They will provide all sorts of instructions from washing clothes to their bodies, to brushing teeth, to keeping clean home. So he was really supervised each and every facet of the workers' lives type of thing, as to whether they were not drinking too much or, and being a good family man, so to speak. So he controlled, each and every aspect of his workers, basically. I mean, he paid them more than they would elsewhere. But at the same time, he controlled the supply line. He not only just manufactured cars, he owned railroads, he acquired coal mines, he owned thousands of acres of timberland in Upper Michigan, acquired sawmills and freighters, ores to Lake Superior, okay, and and even manufactured glass works. So just about anything you can say, his hand was in it, type of thing. But at the same time, he was very static in terms of changing things. And obviously, it's a well-known axiom that all of you have probably heard at some time or the other. Customer can have any car painted as long as it's black, okay? And again, the same stuck with same the model for several decades, and again, and during the First World War, he was a strong pacifist, or isolationist, rather pacifist is probably a wrong word, but isolationist type of thing. And he wanted to, so, and that did not go well with some of his other associates type of thing. And again, so there was one of the faux pas that one can say type of thing. And he at the same time, believed in living wages, and which was twice type thing. Okay, and he did reduce the work finally a little later than in 1926, and the working week was reduced from 48 hours to 40 hours. But at the same time, he had his own internal policing that went on. Okay, you think that Alexa is monitoring you from Amazon. Okay, the same way he had his snoopers and his own people who supervise the workers. They're not allowed to talk, actually. Okay, so they learned to mouth their words, basically. So it was amazing how he controlled the lives of the workers at that time. So it was a different way of doing business, probably wouldn't go too far. And this is some of his evidence for the anti-Semitism, that he was attributed all the evils to Jewish and to the Jewish capitalists. They caused the war, outbreak of thriving robbery all over. And he had his own newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. And again, this may shock us now, but it was against, this was pretty, and no wonder he was very popular with the Nazi, with the early days of AH type thing. Now, it was interesting, there was a Jewish lawyer who actually sued him for libel, okay, because he had singled him out for whatever reason. And he took on the big corporation and won. A guy, this was fascinating, that this was in the early days, sometime in 1920s, a chap named Aaron Sapiro. And, because he had, obviously in his newspaper, he had clearly libeled, and singling him out, he wanted to turn American agriculture over to international Jews to spread communism and Bolshevism to our people. And so he took him to court, and he won settlement up to $1 million or something at that time. So it's an interesting piece of how, how men can be. So I think, perhaps we should. And this was his, I think we'll just take a couple of more minutes, and then we'll wind up for today, at least, And this is, like,
Rob, before you leave Fordism, which you covered very, very well, by the way, apparently in 1922, Ford admitted the era of some of what you just mentioned, which I had found surprising, intriguing, and somewhat disappointing in that era from about 1913 to 1922. In 1922, Ford wrote that I may have been wrong.
Yes, yes, he
trying
did.
The paternalism, which also was so authoritarian that it included going into things like whether the worker was having an affair, whether the worker
Absolutely.
first drank. You mentioned some of those things, but apparently it was kind of like a secret police. And
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
and
Mhm.
unfortunately, Hitler actually quoted the pre-1922 Henry
Mhm.
Ford in Mein Kampf, and I
Mhm.
think visited with Henry Ford on some of those authoritarian and racist things that had basically been a part of what was an unbelievable era in a great American capitalist, which was from 1913 to 1922. He had taken paternalism, kind of like DeSantis in Florida, to a whole new authoritarian level that included moralistic things and other things that were socially and culturally pretty repugnant, and earned the name secret police from 1913 to 2022, the way the Scientologists have also done audits involved in what started out in 1913 as an attempt to try to pay workers twice as much, but to get better workers who were better patriots, who were of better stock and better morally at home, and therefore would be better for America and therefore better for their families, was a paternalistic obsession in 1913, the excesses of which Ford finally renounced in 1922.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there was a guy named Bennett who was his right-hand man. He actually sidelined his son, and he really was not the nicest dad you could say. His son had proposed half a dozen times to modify the line and make the car more attractive, to make changes, but he just didn't give him, any credence to him, and did not listen to him. And there was a guy named Bennett who actually had his own secret, like a Pinkerton type of work that looked on the workers. Yes, they're absolutely right. And they were thugs, actually. And when I think I may have a slide coming up later on that they were there, that the union people, that they were actually beating up the, automobile union people type of thing. And there was one guy who was actually, so now I think I have a later on a slide about that. No, it was an interesting era, I think. Yeah, go ahead. I think, and I'll just finish this one slide that I have, because that way I can say I'm staying on time, because okay. So this was, now this is an interesting type of thing because he was big into building factories and gigantic plants. And this is one of the many type of plants, which is the Highland Park, which is a suburb of Detroit,
Hey, so it's done. Just a couple minutes, and then I'll be done.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. And this was a plant that was designed. And now he was not about hiring the great Jewish architect named Albert Kahn and Associates. Okay. So this was kind of a study in contrast type thing, and Kahn was a Russian, I think a Eastern European or German immigrant type of thing. And he lined up, he studied architecture in US and had started his own firm. And he was the industrial architect par excellence. He designed factories, a lot of not just for Detroit, but he even designed factories for Stalin. Okay, so this is, it's an interesting how this thing. So this was, and he was employed by this thing. So this was the Highland Park plant. It's gigantic, to put it mildly, type of thing. Okay, and similarly, varieties of his factories are still huge thing. So I think we'll stop at this stage, and then we'll finish up with Ford and move on to the bigger conglomerate, which is a totally antithesis in terms of philosophy and as to how to run business type of thing, which is none other than General Motors. Okay, so I'll stop right here and we'll stick around for a while type of thing. And I think I'm pretty much on time, type of thing. I think I'm going to send out, if I have a couple of videos, then I'll just send out the links, because if you play the video, it just takes up too much time type of thing, in between. Okay, folks, let me stop the recording if I can find the right button.